What is a visual novel? In technical terms, a visual novel is a video game that is told in the form of a novel. At one point, they were known as sound novels for their use of music and not just text. Now, for a moment, we're just going to get into the technicalities. Most VNs are told in a rather standard fashion. The character sprites are set in front of certain static backgrounds depicting the sort of place that the action is taking place in. Most VNs are choice-based games, those choices affecting immediate dialogue and often what ending the game will have. Now, personally, I'm pretty flexible about what I'd call a visual novel. Some people go for strict definitions, either going for VNs that are entirely text-based or that only have optional mini games. As I said, my own definition allows for a certain amount of flexibility, especially as I tend to combine game types instead of going for strict games. What do I mean by this? For example, Persona 5 is a JRPG with turn-based combat and visual novel elements. The game is influenced enough by text-based choices in the game that if I were to create a favorite visual novels list, this game would make it. But sometimes I start to think about what I would and wouldn't consider a visual novel, as even for me, Persona 5 can stretch the limit. And there are quite a few games that I have in mind that sometimes remind me of novels, but are in no way visual novels. These are generally games that have text options. The first game I thought of for some reason when I started thinking about what makes a VN and what doesn't was Fallout, specifically Fallout New Vegas. While no one would actually call that game a visual novel, the times when you go up to someone and their words are written out, because I never play a game without subtitles, and you are given different ways to answer, that reminds me of elements of VNs. Especially when your choices in what you say in that moment affect the game in various ways. Other games that fall into the remind me of VNs without being a VN are games like Hades, Paradise Killer, Disco Elysium, The Tales of Borderlands. Though honestly, almost every Telltale game kind of reminds me of VN, but moving on. There's always something in those games that keeps me from ever giving it even a VN subtitle. Like, Hades' plot moves forward through mastery of the hack and slash fighting style. Disco Elysium is a point and click adventure game where the dice decide your fate. But once again, conversations take place in text boxes with sprites, with background representing the place that you are in the game. Hell, in a lot of Telltale games, you move the plot forward by doing the click and point and click kind of gameplay to it, but there are equally important moments where in conversation, that's when the big game changing moments can happen. But those games I just mentioned, those are not visual novels. Now, here are ones that I kind of keep going back and forth on. Usually I think of them as visual novels, but sometimes I think of them as video games with visual novel elements. This would be games like Persona 5 and Lobotomy Corporation, Yuppie Psycho, and Corpse Party. These are games that stamp all over the idea of visual novels not being proper VNs if the gameplay interferes with moving the story forward. Persona 5 revolves around moving the plot forward by playing parts that are mostly consist of you mastering turn-based fighting skills and stealth with monsters. Even when you're in the real world of the Persona 5 games, you still do stuff besides the visual novel aspects. You're moving your character around, you're doing like management of your time. Then there are games like Lobotomy Corporation that wouldn't be the same without those sort of visual novel moments where you talk to Angela or other certain characters. However, if you do not figure out how to manage the monsters that you are in control of, which is super hard, then you miss everything in the game and you are going nowhere fast. Honestly, if there was one game I wish I could like somehow transfer into a VN, it would be this one. There would be a certain game mechanic that would be difficult to effectively represent without, managing those monsters in your time. And I can't really talk about it because of spoilers. But this game is also ridiculous, and I can't beat it, and I want the story. Please let me have the story. For Corpse Party, I kind of think it depends on which one you're playing, whether you're going to lean more visual novel or not. The first and third ones are more like VN types. They're games that tell the story mostly through text and artwork for the characters, but you take control of the characters and maneuver them around in the game, usually solving puzzles to continue the game itself. More like a point and click adventure game. The second game feels more like a visual novel, and the gag, like Sachiko's Birthday, also is more visual novel esque and mostly is just text based. But even those have moments where you're in a room and you're clicking various like places in the room to try and find objects or make certain discoveries instead of just reading the text that is there. Now, finally, we had the visual novels where if you tried to deny that they were a visual novel, you'd raise some eyebrows. There are famous ones like Higurashi and Umineko in the When They Cry series, Clanad, Steins Gate, and Move Love, which are just quick off the top examples. Now I want you to consider Spirit Hunter Deathmark, where you kind of are on the ledge, but I would say if someone said it wasn't visual novel, they'd be kind of silly. It's like a visual novel with point and click parts to it that you can't really actually break unless you're trying to. Yes, you have to bring the right people with you. Yes, you have to have correct items when you meet the spirit that you're investigating. But most of the story is text heavy, and even figuring out what to do is dependent on reading everything that comes across the screen. Then there are games like Dramatical Murder, where choices you make through text lead to you to choose one of the love interest routes. And whether you get the good or bad ending depends on what you do once you've chosen that person. Here, there's literally no gameplay, no static scenes that you're exploring and pointing and clicking and trying to find various things for them to observe, nothing to pick up and nothing to pick up and use against an enemy, which isn't to say that there isn't action going on. There are characters getting into fights, but the player has minimal to no input onto how those fights play out. Most of the time, you don't even get to see the action. Instead, whatever fight that's happening right at that moment will be described in text to you with flashes of color and sound effects, with the sprites holding different poses as you read about the amazing fight scene taking place in front of you that you have to imagine in your head. At the far end of the spectrum, where you're going to get pure visual novel, are games like Higurashi and Umineko. I'm sure someone other than Ryu Shikio 7 has written a visual novel that has little to no options and it's just pure reading mixed with visuals and sound and music. Fuck, now that I think about it, if you watch the VNs in their original way they were drawn and written, you don't have any sound, you don't have voice actors, you just have music. Which I once added a patch that gave Higurashi the treatment of having all the voice acting, pretty sprites, and full artwork for certain moments, and I actually found that I liked the basic more. When it comes down to it, I think for me, what a visual novel is, and whether it's something I think of a visual novel, not as a game with visual novel elements, is what would be left if the text was gone? This is why Persona is on the edge for me, because if you remove the written parts, yes, you'd miss a few choices, but exploring the dungeon and the gameplay, even in the more slice of life moments, there is enough of the story within it that you could kind of suss out the story in it. Or pretend you couldn't talk to anybody in Fallout and you were just walking around. Yes, you'd miss a lot of key moments, but you'd still get the story of Fallout by interacting with the world. You'd be able to see this world and experience it, even if you couldn't talk to anybody. Now take the text out of Umineko or even the House of Fata Morgana. You'd have static sprites that move when you click your mouse and a pretty background. Well, in Umineko, you'd also have amazing music, but what is left for you to take in if you take out the visual novel, like the text and the characters talking back and forth? There is literally nothing. There are just people talking on the screen. Then there are games like Danganronpa, which some people would say is not a visual novel, but I have a hard time not seeing how the game could be played without the visual, the text options in it. But the funny thing about Danganronpa is if you take away the text, you also take away some of the gameplay as well. Overall, I'd say, like most things, it seems easy to spot a VN when you read it, but then you start thinking about it too much and you realize how nuanced of a genre VNs actually are, how flexible its walls can be, until it feels like there's no definite wall that you can put between what is and isn't a visual novel. Not that we don't try to define it, because we like things that can be cut and dry, unfortunately. I've just always found I've been good at being flexible. So while I can say that some games are more purely like visual novel, what text based than others, there are others with gameplay that really pushes whether or not it is a visual novel or not. Is it a visual novel or is it a like hack and slash with visual novel elements? Where is that line? What about you? What games straddle that line for you? Are there any games that I feel are still VNs that you would think only having VN elements? Let me know in the comments below. Hopefully, all of us can gain a deeper understanding of this great visual game genre.